it feels like we've lost our ability to think about dreams as useful things. Dreamers are described as untethered or distracted, or they're not working, they're not productive. But I'm really interested in trying to get designers, but also just people to think about dreams being blueprints for reality.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Vicki Tan is a product designer, a public speaker, a student of behavioral psychology, and a dog mom based in Brooklyn. She currently works at Spotify and has previously worked at Headspace, Lyft, and Google. She cares deeply about the human aspects of design and the insights that data cannot provide. In her spare time, she's working on an illustrated book on cognitive bias. We spoke in mid-July 2022, and I was excited to talk to Vicki because she's been at the center of designing some really delightful digital experiences in Headspace, Lyft, and Spotify, and has given interesting talks on the complex interactions of data, logic, and creativity. It was a lot of fun to talk to Vicki, as happens in the best conversations between like-minded individuals. We branched across many topics. When we were done recording, I was a little upset when I found out that due to a bug in our recording software, the high-quality recording of my side of the conversation was lost. The low quality is still perfectly understandable, though, and Vicki's side sounds great. Still, I want to apologize for that. We've since switched our recording tool to a better one, hopefully, and so I hope this won't happen again. Still, this was a wide-ranging and interesting conversation. We covered how Vicki got into design by forging notes for school, studying behavioral psychology and using that lens in design, her early work in psychological research, how she found her way into Google, the importance of cognitive ability in hiring practices, the unique culture at Headspace, the challenges of designing a meditation app, the role of intuition in design, and our over-reliance on data, what finding umami means to her book in the works on cognitive bias, self-coherence as a way to help our own cognitive bias, and dreams as a blueprint for reality. One of my favorite things about being a product designer is meeting other product designers. There's something about the open-mindedness, mindfulness, optimism, and interdisciplinary interests that seem to be a recurring pattern, and which makes the best product designers a real delight to talk to, and Vicki is no different. This conversation is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with top designers, thinkers, makers, authors, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So please follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Vicki Tan. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from Vicki Tan. Vicki, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And so my first question is, these days, I try to bring us back into our world and our daily experience. And so I want to ask, what's it like to be Vicki Tan in the world these days?
Oh, I love that. I guess because everybody has their own little world, huh? I've been thinking about this a lot this week and these couple of months because I just moved. And so whenever you move and you're in a new situation, you're encountering many, many more new people. Yeah, it just becomes much more noticeable. But what it's like for me, I like it. It's great. I usually walk around with a big, fluffy white dog. And what it means is that everybody turns to us and smiles. And everybody has the same set of a few questions. And as the owner of like a big dog who kind of looks like a polar bear, you have to be very patient and gracious with answering the same few questions. And what's cool is that it's helped me just be more friendly with strangers on the street, even when he's not there. And so I guess that was a roundabout way of saying, as I've gotten older, and I don't know if this is typical, but I feel like I've gotten more and more friendly to just anything going on the street.
Yeah. So you moved to Brooklyn, correct? You used to.
Yeah.
So I heard you say in one of your previous interviews that one of the reasons you ended up in Google is that the other option was to move to New York and you didn't like New York at the time. And now you're living in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
So, what changed?
That's so your mind reader, because I was thinking about that this week, and I was thinking about it as I had just finished like playing tennis on a wall, like in a kids playground as they have in Brooklyn. And I was walking around just covered in sweat as you do in the New York humid summer and thinking, I don't really care. I don't care about my appearance at this moment. And it feels very different than when I visited New York in my 20s. And this was pre-COVID by a long time. But back then, I feel like when I visited, everyone was dressed up and trying very hard and trying hard in an effortless way for them. But it felt out of reach for me as like a 20-something-year-old out of college from California, having grew up in like Cupertino, a very tiny city. When I got to New York, I think the amount of, I don't even want to call it ambition, but the amount of like creative, unique, like self-expressive energy that was there felt like almost, it made me feel insignificant. And I think that as you do when you're maybe in your 20s, you compare a little bit more. You're looking at what other people are doing, how they look, like who they're with, and what their life is like. And I think it just felt like I couldn't live in New York because of that. It would just be impossible to be content. And now that I'm here, I'm 38. And it's funny because the situation, the relative situation, the objective situation, I should say, hasn't changed, but my mindset has changed to some extent. There's not a full contentedness, but I can walk around and meet all these incredible people and feel happy that we've each gone deep in our own path without feeling envy or like that knee-jerk comparison.
Did I have the similar, because I moved to New York in my 20s.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if I had some of that. Maybe I was just too obstinate to be like, I don't care about any of that stuff. Yeah, I think, but I think there's definitely so much of everything, and there's so many really impressive people.
Yeah.
That I can see how easily you can get intimidated by all of that and just not want to be. And it's also nonstop. So I like to start the conversation by getting to know the person and their past a little bit. And so my opening question is for this exploration is, what's something you learned in childhood or early in life that is still alive in you today, still guides you or drives?
Yeah. Any of my coworkers can attest to this mindset I'm about to say. I don't know if this is why I'm like the way I am, but I tend to operate from a place of rules are very much suggestions to be like tested or pushed on, or if there's no rationale to a rule or a set of constraints or whatever, then I tend to disregard them, which, I think that's what they should be for. And so I don't know if this is why, but I grew up, it was just very quiet. So Cupertino is where Steve Jobs started Apple, but beyond that, like fame, it was just a bunch of nerdy engineers, Chinese, Indian, and Caucasian engineers, like the true like .com engineers wearing their very faded, like whatever. My mom had like an HP shirt with the tennis shoes. Like it was original tech.
Mm.
And they were very just conservative and hardworking 9 to 5ers. And people there did follow rules. Like it was go with the grain. And so I actually don't know why this happened to me, but I grew up a little bit rebellious. My dad passed when I was in grade school. And I think that caused me to feel, as any emo kid or angsty teen feels, like mad at the world, or just a little bit like confused about like why me, why him, why now. And so I think some of that in my childhood, or at least as discussed with my therapist, like some of the idea that you have to like fend for yourself or like make your own way as a child, losing your parent. I was closer to my dad. I remember there was one specific situation where I lived too close to school to drive my car in, but it was really cool to have a cool car. Like I had a very fast and furious esque like rice rocket. And I wanted to drive it to school to look cool, which is your primary goal at that time. And I had to, I didn't have to. I forged. This was one of an early design project. I forged like a parking pass because they wouldn't give me one because I lived too close. But I wanted to drive the car in, and so I got caught in the end. But I was like, had to do it.
That's so funny. We had a party and like an evening, maybe a year or so ago, with some of the top designers in tech in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
And someone asked, how did you get started with design? And 50% of people said forging IDs to get access.
I mean, I
That was the
can't.
first time I opened Photoshop.
I love that. I don't tell my mom, but I definitely forged report cards. I think I forged like that was like the OG early days of like I think using I don't know Microsoft Word, like actually photocopying, cutting, like forging. But it's true. I would say if you have a propensity for getting in there like that, it's probably a good indicator.
Yeah, challenging defaults. So you take this spirit and you end up going and studying behavioral psychology. So what
Yeah.
made you choose that? And then maybe you can give me a little bit of intro on behavioral psychology and how it's different from psychology regular.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is testing my I went to school in 2002 through 6, so this is definitely testing. And I started off just as a psychology major, and you end up choosing a specialization as you go, but it felt like psychology was a way to understand people in the real world, to understand feelings, how you feel. Like, I am a confused, angsty teen. I don't understand what's going on. Like, this can help me make sense of things. And so I remember thinking, like, these are the only classes that I'm not absolutely bored by or confused by. Like, organic chemistry, I just did not actually could not compute.
Yeah.
And then there was like the fancy calculus that you get into where you're like, where are we in mental models here? Like, but psychology felt not only rigorous, like in terms of the research aspect, but yeah, useful in a not just a theoretical but applied way.
Is this something that you still think about a lot in your work today? Do you have your psychological lens on when you do design work?
Yeah, I mean, for better or for worse, I think as I've made my way through my career, it's definitely been something that I've relied on because I don't have the design school formal training skill set. When in doubt, a classically trained designer, whatever that is, might rely on a certain set of tools that maybe they're more visual or maybe they are more systems or maybe they are more patterns. My fallback, if you will, like if I don't know what to do, I'll think about, yeah, behavioral science. I'll think about, which is helpful because there's the end user, which are humans. I'll tend to think about it from that angle, which I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong or even one way, but the idea that more people than not are using a different framework just means that this framework or this approach is helpful because it's different.
Yeah, it's funny. I find that there's really two types of designers: the ones that study design and the ones that study something else interesting in the humanities.
Yeah.
That tends to be the break. I was all over the place. I studied philosophy, history, and film before I got into design.
That's incredible. That's the trifecta, right?
Yeah, except maybe. So after school you go into research and you have some research jobs, and actually your first job at Google was as a researcher. So I'd love to hear about that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I was trying to think more about your previous question about how behavioral science has shown up in each of them, but I think this makes more sense to step through them. So, yeah, the first few jobs that I had were in research labs. I was just a research assistant. My very first one was in an alcoholism lab, which means getting college kids drunk at 8 a.m. It was a fascinating first job. We were looking at the genetics of alcoholism too. So people don't think about predisposition or like where we all begin is different for everyone, right? And if you have a drink versus I have a drink, or people also don't think about like how we are changing our DNA as we live life. I feel like these concepts feel very abstract for our day to day, but I went on a path of doing it was the next diabetes research. I worked in pulmonology, and then last was pediatric oncology, which everyone, they hear that they're so sad about it. Like kids who have cancer, what could be like more sad? And counterintuitively, that job was one of the best I had in terms of the people who are the doctors and the nurses who decide to work in that field, and the kiddos, like, and their families. Like, it's actually so heartwarming despite the glaring obviousness of the situation. And also for those families, like the adversity of finding that out, like whether for a newborn or a young child, puts things into perspective, right? You don't get to worry about, like, I don't want to call them dumb things. You don't get to be so concerned with trivial things.
Yeah.
But I'll say this over and over throughout my career. It was very lucky that somebody from Google reached out to me. That career path I just described was pretty unfocused. The types of research weren't even behavioral science, they were just research to have work experience. And even then, my degree, like whatever paper I wrote at the end of it, it was just an undergrad degree that I got from a place. But somebody from Google was my manager at the time. Shannon Shaper was building an experimental team looking at how we hire people and what makes like somebody a good performer, a good employee over the duration of their career at Google. So not just what makes them good at X role, but also Y second role and Z third role in the future. And so we were trying to look at something they called cognitive ability that's been talked about a little bit more since then. And so they just hired a bunch of random people with different types of like organizational psychology, social psychology, just like psych degrees. And yeah, it was kind of a motley crew of people. And I loved that team because it was people from all corners of I don't even know where they're all at now. But yeah, there wasn't a direct connection for what I was doing to what I started doing there. And it ended up just being a perfect segue for me. So the research we did, it was a type of industrial organizational psychology using frameworks to not only predict behavior, but also reduce bias in the hiring process.
Yeah. And so those studies, I remember when they came out because I think some of them ended up being quite influential outside of Google. So, what are some of the completely overrated factors that turned out to be not so predictive versus the surprisingly predictive element that people didn't think about?
Yeah, the short answer is that cognitive ability is the most predictive, which is a combination of your ability to understand the problem really quickly, to like use data when you approach the problem. Like, are you gathering data? And it's like a problem solving approach. When we saw that people employed this approach when answering questions or reflected about behavioral past situations they've been in, if they could talk us through like the rationale for certain choices, all the different solutions they considered, and they could do it in a coherent way. Having high cognitive ability was the most predictive for future success in any role at Google. But beyond that, some of the things that felt counterintuitive to everyone there, except for the researchers, was that adding more structure to an interview made it better. Because people think we're human, we're people who feel like, especially the older you get, the more you build your intuition, the more people you encounter, the better judges of character I think people think they are. And people like to think they could use their gut and intuition to make a hiring decision. But often those are anchored on factors that have nothing to do with performance. So that's one. The adding the structure, even adding like an interview script, adding follow-up questions, things we tend to forget to do when we're in the flow, like your past self who's trying to hire a good employee, that structure helps your future self remember what your past self wanted in an applicant. It's just like if you're dating someone and you get smitten by their how good they are at this, that, and the other, and you forget about all those actual things you wanted, about like your longer term goals. You wanted the classic, you wanted to get married and have kids. Oh, but this person's a drummer, like and not to say you can't, but it's like that where
They're
you
not
said you wanted
they're
these
not
things.
into marriage and kids, let's say. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and so you started as a researcher in Google and you pivoted to being a designer. And I think there's probably some people who would like to do a similar pivot or maybe the other way, but how do you do it? How do you make it happen?
Yeah,
And
I love
did you
telling this
intend to do
story.
it?
Yeah, that's a good. Did I intend to do it? Well, also, first, I'll clarify. I started as just an associate of a research team. A researcher, saying I was a researcher would be giving myself too much credit. I worked with a researcher just like I did in any of those other labs. There was someone with a PhD who knew deeply about behavioral science and was creating protocols for us to see through. So we were hired on a contract. And at the end of maybe it was a year, only a handful of our team could be converted to full time employees. And it felt a little like the Hunger Games, where we were like, all right, like we were so close. We had such a good time. You imagine going from a research lab with like Folgers and crappy like cereal to Google, which literally has like just restaurants and slides and balloons and and so we were like, this is the dream. This is adult Disneyland. And we each had to come up with a specialty, like a talent almost to be chosen for conversion. And it was fascinating just as its own social experiment to see one of our friends became more of like a data analyst. He was good at the spreadsheets and the formulas. And another was more managerial. And I don't even know what the other ones became. I became the like visual design person. And what's really cool about Google is that everyone's willing to help you, or I found that people were willing to help me as a random person in the organization. And the very first design problem that I worked on that team was we came up with this amazing framework. It lived in a very extensive spreadsheet, and we needed every single Googler to use it when they interviewed. And no one loves interviewing. Like it takes up their time. You do it like so infrequently that you're not really an expert in it. Like the payoff is quite low because most of the people you aren't hiring. And so to add something else that like some people had to learn about and they had to use this new thing, people weren't that interested. But for us as an internal team testing our framework, we needed people to use it. And it's good for them, it's good for us, it's good for the company. So designing a tool that felt like almost like an interviewing tool that felt exciting to use, that maybe it would save time for you, it would help you come to a decision. Like that was the first project I inadvertently took on. And it ended up being just perfect for the idea that I would know the subject matter so well. And it was internal, so fairly low stakes. That's sort of how the transition began. And so what's important for people who are trying to make that transition to know is like, it wasn't fast. It wasn't like, oh, I started off as a researcher and I just asked for a design role and boom. Like, I wasn't super interested in working on HR tools, but those were the ones that were like small deviations away from what I was doing. And because of that, they were perfect. They were perfect because it was easy for me to only focus on at the time, like learning Illustrator, learning Photoshop, learning Keynote, versus trying to learn a whole new subject matter and becoming an expert in that in order to design for it.
Yeah. And then so you spent some time in Google as a designer. And then you have all of these great companies after that, Lyft, Headspace, and now Spotify, that it almost feels like too long of a journey to treat separately. I want to ask you, what was this journey like? And how did you see these companies? How are they different? How are they the same? What was your experience of them?
Yeah. Well, Lyft was the first like real. I know I was doing design in bits and pieces at Google, but Lyft felt like the first real design job I had. And because it was such a small team, this was back when we still had the pink mustache, there was balloons in the app. Like this was OG Lyft.
Yeah.
And one of the first projects we did was redesigning the whole app so that you could request your ride in a different way. At the time, it felt like if we did that well, you actually wouldn't need to have your phone out after doing the thing. Like by and large, Lyft is a very backgroundable app when things go well. In some ways, so is Headspace. Like you put it on, hopefully we get you quickly to what you need and you're just listening and meditating and hopefully you use your phone less. There's a lot of counterintuitiveness in some of the products that I've worked on in that the UI, which is what we design, is not the hero. We design like an offline experience or like an off-screen experience. Similar with Spotify because it's an audio platform, and this is kind of like a shoe I'm trying to make fit. But a lot of it isn't like the super cool interaction that I made, like the in app experience or whatever. It's getting you something you need that makes like either a convenience in your day or like a smoothness in your day, an improvement in your day, like changes your mood, helps the atmosphere. I think I'm really drawn to consumer facing products now for that reason. I haven't done anything really B2B or anything systems level. Like my capacity for like design work is very like experiential and I'm happy to like lean into that. I don't want to be a systems designer. Like I'm far too disorganized for that. And as well, more than the actual design problems, I've tried to choose companies based on my immediate team. Do I like working with these people? Can I spend a lot of time with them? Do I feel safe, especially at Lyft, not knowing any design? Do I feel safe asking really dumb questions? Do I feel safe showing things in a messy, unformed way, like before things have gotten too far along? Like, yeah.
It's funny because it's part of the team research in Google that showed that psychological safety was a great predictor of team success.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think makes these three stand out to me, Lyft, Headspace, and Spotify, is they have a very unique voice, a very strong brand that they know who they are. The app really speaks in a very unique visual language. And I'm especially wondering about Headspace. So I actually got to interview Andy as an expert in the design sprint a couple of years ago. It was such a pleasure because I saw his business mind. He's not just because you could imagine him being like this monkish, very mindful, spiritual fellow, and he is, I'm sure. But he also when we asked him about strategy and really important questions like that, and he was fast.
Yeah.
So, what was the culture like at Headspace? Because you would imagine a company that dedicated to mindfulness would have somewhat of a different feel than other tech companies.
Yeah. I mean, we were in Santa Monica in LA. So moving from San Francisco to Santa Monica and it just being more relaxed and casual. The people who worked there, it was early stage. 200 or something at the time. Every single person when I joined was just like loved meditation. It wasn't in a like drinking the punch way. It was like they wanted to work there because they were mindful. They thought a lot about, even now, some of the friends that I have that were from there, that's what they're still pursuing because that's just their interest. So the culture there was exactly how you would imagine a company of people working on mindfulness and meditation. Everyone was thoughtful, curious, courteous. I love the idea that the customer service reps, normally who are helping you troubleshoot, like, my account got locked out and my app is broken. They turned out to be mini like meditation guides. Like people would call it and say, when I was doing the anxiety course or this or that sleep pack, I experienced this. And they would provide support on people's practice.
Wow.
And, when we would have meetings, Andy would be there trying to help us understand how. So I was working on onboarding. How did they onboard people into the monastery? How did they teach them healthy habits for meditation? What are the lessons that he learned in Tibet? And how do we translate those into the app? Whereas at other tech companies, what you're trying to do is so different. You're not trying to like capture something in, and maybe you are, but nowhere else that I've worked are you trying to actually just make digital something very analog. And that's kind of tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I would imagine like it needs to be a counterweight to that. So when there's like, so here's how we did it in the monastery in Tibet, and then someone has to say, well, here's how apps work, and it's different. And then the conversation is where the truth actually emerged, because there's probably some value in the way the monastery did it, but it's somewhere you can't just copy it.
Exactly.
Right.
And these people, regular old consumers, are not monks.
Right.
But yes, so many just nuggets of wisdom from being there. You just get immersed in it. I felt really lucky to be there at that time. I felt like it was what I needed post Silicon Valley tech. And the nudge of having twice daily meditations as a company. Like I think all companies should do that. First thing in the morning as a whole company, if you're there, if you want. We meditated in like the open all hands area. And then in the afternoon, kind of when you're feeling the slump, if you want, you can go sit there. The fact that it'll be playing, sometimes Andy would lead it live. Sometimes it would just be a recording, but I love that that's like a standing ritual. I wish it would just happen in my house. Like, oh yeah, the meditation's happening right now.
Well, it's really interesting. I got into meditation through an actual center in New York, but I learned it through people and through kind of guided, just people. And so I never got into apps. I've tried all of them. You would think that I'm a product designer. You'd think I'd get excited about meditation apps, but I can't get into it. Like I would rather sit without one. But
I think that's great.
I think they're probably a helpful way in, but there's a sense of dependence that can grow.
Yeah.
And maybe someone's voice is not always the best thing to hear in your head when you're meditating. Maybe you need some quiet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you encounter, just because I'm so curious about it, did you encounter that tension of like, what if what they need is to sit quietly with their own stuff?
Yeah. And if you get past some of the basics, the speaking does happen less frequently. The periods of silence happen for longer. But that question came in a lot, which is, hey, I'm a experienced meditator. Do you have silent meditations? Or like, do you have less guided meditations? And there wasn't a good progression of content for people who had graduated past what you probably know of Headspace. And for better or for worse, like Headspace is an app to teach you meditation or for beginners, like for people who might not at all be able to sit down quietly. And so I think if you think about it that way, it to me feels like one way to get somewhere that you've already gotten to. So of course it doesn't make sense for you to use it, but there's many people who naturally would not be able to get where you've gotten on your own. It's like a training wheels thing.
Not on my own, but I guess because I started through actually human teachers.
Yeah.
in the sitting room, then I guess I never, the apps, there weren't that many apps available at the time. And so later when they came out, maybe I missed that train.
But that's a interesting trade-off, right? Which is more people know about meditation because of Headspace, mindfulness meditation because of Headspace, but perhaps their practice is not as deep or sustained. I think the most common Headspace user I encounter is one who has the app but does not use it. It's just sitting there on their phone, almost like a intention or a reminder of, it's like the stack of books you want to read. It's like, this is your like ideal self, and then there's your reality.
Yep, yep.
And so the question is it better that we've made this like halfway there thing, or should we have left it as you're either doing it or you're not?
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So you talked about designing with intuition, and you talked about the things that data won't tell you. So Headspace seems like a good place to practice intuitive design. It's not that, I mean, that they clearly use data, but it seems like they would be open to that intuition. So tell me more about how you see the relationship between design and data and intuition. What's your latest
Thinking.
what's your latest thinking on that?
Yeah, you know, when I wrote that talk, I was at Headspace, and it's not to say Headspace or anywhere else, or even tech in general. My I don't want to call it a complaint. My criticism in that talk is that we are over reliant on data. And given we can run experiments, given the number of users, subscribers, like given revenue, given investors, like it makes a lot of sense to proceed with caution. But just like with polling, or I don't know, with anywhere else where you can rely on like a tangible thing, we forget about that like intangible thing. So I'm not contesting the usefulness or the utility or the benefits of data. But what I noticed was it felt like we didn't have a good way of integrating the other part of it, like our gut, which is funny because I just finished talking about how our gut in hiring isn't super useful. What I wanted was for there to be more of like a framework that took into account the less quantified aspects along with data. But because data is so tangible, we over rely on it. And I wanted a nice balance. You know, even working at Headspace, we'd run some of the experiments of the features I designed. We run them for the 2 weeks, 4 weeks. We see how much they affect retention, subscribers. If they didn't, like, maybe we wouldn't ship it. And it's like, but how is it helping someone's practice? Was that a question we asked when we decided whether or not to leave it in the product? No. Is it because we're running a business? Probably yes. But would it have hurt to leave it in? Not to me, but I don't run the servers. I don't pay the engineers to maintain them. But as a designer, I think you feel a certain type of like pain when you put a lot into it. It seems to resonate with people, and it gets such a short duration to prove its worth. It feels very, performative. And who knows? Like people's practice ebbs and flows, and the way in which we relate to apps also does. And I don't know, looking at numbers over 2 weeks, I just felt like, oh, but that's why I'm not a PM.
Yeah, I feel like I also I naturally gravitate towards like brand new products. We run sprints with like startups that are building a new product. So there's no data.
Yeah.
And it suits me well because I prefer conversations over data. I prefer to talk to people who are having this problems and get to the bottom of it and then imagine solutions. And the data will come later. I believe in the value of data. I just don't get excited about the data being my master. Um,
Exactly.
and that's what the early stage is fascinating to me. You talk about finding umami.
Oh, yeah. That's a funny title I came up with one day.
Yeah, which I always try to find umami when I cook. I always try
Yeah.
to find it in my
Yeah.
soup or whatever. It's missing some umami. So, what does finding umami mean to
Yeah. And I'm glad you called out the title because there was something I was trying to do with the title and with the term, which is something people do all the time in tech. Like, as soon as or even in psychology, anywhere, as soon as you give something a name, it becomes something like it's embodied. In tech, there are names for all sorts of things, like a flywheel or like like things where you're like, I actually start to cringe now when I hear some of them because they're always spoken about. And same as like ROI or like active users or subs, like we name it and then we talk about it and then we care about it. And so what I was trying to do was name this idea that I had, which we've been talking about, the idea that like sometimes things that matter are hard to quantify, but when they're missing, it's like it's so important. One example I gave in the talk was just a real life example about like grades or any other like standard measurements of intelligence. Like here we have the SATs. I think there's probably a version of that in any country. And maybe along with some essays and things like that, a lot of your life is unlocked with how well you do on standardized tests.
you?
But then as you get older, as you move through life, you realize that for yourself and for people you encounter, people you work with, people you're hiring for your team, like there's a lot more than like how they did the SAT or the score. The GPA represents the very last point. This is just like a number we placed at the end of a very long thing. It's like it flattens a lot of the experience.
Mm.
And I think about everything else that makes somebody successful or everything else that differentiates a 4.0 person from another one. And it's softer, like intangible, like their communication style and their graciousness and their collaboration style and things like that. And
Mm.
because those are harder to compare one to one or even to quantify, like we can give them categorical names, but even then, not everything fits in X number of buckets. I wanted to like start to introduce that idea in technology, in products, in how we build products. And I wanted us to either start to create metrics or even just create ideas, create ways to measure that in our products. We say we care about all these things. At Headspace, we said we cared about health and happiness as like a top line mission. But then the metrics, like I said in that previous example, we care about subscribers and revenue. And so, where is the translation from our mission of health and happiness to things we can measure day to day? And, maybe too simplified would be to say, like, let's measure people's subjective happiness who use the app. Or some of them I thought about at Headspace could have been like, health outcomes. That's something we happen to measure already. Could we look at heart blood pressure or things that are actually causes for morbidity in the US at least? At Lyft, it had to do with community building and like sharing rides and things. So can we measure cohesion in the community? Or at Spotify, we care about like helping creators in their livelihoods. We don't really talk about what are these creator artists' livelihoods. Like there's a lot of complaints about that, which around royalties. So if we're trying to help artists be self-sustained, like shouldn't we track how well they're doing? And I
Yeah.
know that sounds like, of course, but nobody does it.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do, isn't it? So I've worked on a couple of dating apps
Yeah.
and really well-meaning dating apps. And then you look at the market of dating apps and theoretically they want to help you find a relationship, right? Theoretically. That's not at all how they measure it, right? They measure it, income from subscriptions, which by definition, as long as the person keeps paying, that means that they haven't found that significant other,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, and I sat down and I honestly tried to think about how could you align the business model with the stated goal? And it's not trivial at all because I guess the best that I could come up with was charge a flat fee when they find, I don't know, charge them $1,000 when they find someone. Don't charge them anything until they do.
I mean,
But that's hard to
or
implement, right?
yeah, or just have some trust that the success story of that person finding their life partner and them talking about it to other people will eventually mean that other people are on the platform because it's a platform that works, because the product had faith in like doing what it set out to do, not just making money. So a good example is exact same Headspace. If you learn to meditate without Headspace, you're no longer a subscriber. We don't get that monthly revenue from you. But like if you learn to meditate and aren't using it, but maybe you are a mentor on the platform and you teach other people, or maybe you talk about how amazing and mindful you feel like your life has become, other people try it. I think there's other ways that we can grow that include there being like, we're not happy about it being a finite amount of time that you stay with an app, a lease on an app, like a, let's do this for a year. And if we teach someone, if we find their mate in a year, if we teach you meditation a year, that's success. Like,
Mm.
I love that. Like, we need that.
Yeah, I guess part of me wants it to be like 5 minutes, like because you have everyone, don't you? Can't you just match me with someone who like will get
Yeah.
me off the app next week,
Yeah.
assuming I'm ready and they're ready, and that we're ready, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so, and in fact, I believe that's what the CEO of Hinge is saying, that every time they improve the dynamic, they get a flood of signups because of word of mouth that people are having success.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So I want to ask about your design process. So you described yourself as disorganized,
Yes, all my teammates can probably attest.
and yet it seems to work. So tell me about how are you thinking about the creative process these days?
I love that. It seems to work. um, you know how there's people who are just organized with their layers, organized with their documents, organized with their notes. Yeah, I've never been that organized. I think as I've gone on, it's gotten more disorganized, and not in a super chaotic way. I'll write things down, but somewhere, like it'll be a notebook, notes on my app, a post-it, like so it'll be somewhere. Like I at least will write it down. And then they'll just slowly be revisited in no particular order while walking, in the shower, while talking. It's almost like a memory palace with no, the concept of a memory palace.
Yeah, I think is it the technique for memorization, right?
Yeah, where you build a mental, you could say palace, you could say home. It's just this mental space where I'm not going to describe this perfectly, but as you enter the first room, the theory is that like you're familiar with the room and the contextual placement of all the knowledge or memories or whatever information is more easily retrievable given the like you're using the physicality of the space as a way to remember.
Mm.
And so those memory palaces, I presume, are organized like a library almost. Like, oh, I'm going to this room that has all of this information and I can pull out that volume and reference it. If we were to use a memory palace as an example for mine, what I enjoy is that I've been referring to it as gentle chaos because chaos has a negative connotation, but the gentle chaos of having all this stuff in a room. Imagine I just put a bunch of like weird things in a room. Somehow this room has no gravity in my mind. They're just things floating around. And say you walk into that room, you might just get gently hit in the face with one, two, or three things from the last few months. And then you can like grab and go, and some of it you toss out, some of it you keep, some of it you hold on and it forms a little more, some of it you take away. Does that describe the process at all?
So you said it does, but you told me last time we spoke about the way things come together
Okay.
and how these different things that you've done throughout your life or throughout your day, whether it's reading a sci-fi book or, an article or playing a game, that all of these things feed into your creative process.
Yeah.
And I really relate to that. And so, does it feel like it requires a certain level of chaos? I mean, you're curious about so many things and you keep collecting and you keep trying different things. And you don't know ahead of time how they're going to fit, right? So they have to be floating
Yeah.
without gravity somewhere because you don't know when they'll collide and create something.
Yeah. And I think this kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier about, you said history, film, philosophy, and how that influences you as a designer or just as a human. Like, to me, the more disparate ideas that I can pluck from different corners of my experience, and not even my experience, like anyone's experience, I think the more interesting, useful it is because we get tunnel vision. Like any sort of specialization creates like these blind spots. And I get it. We need specialization, but like we need to commingle. And when I read like a sci-fi book, which is a type of world building, which is a type of like observation on humanity, it's not just fantasy, right? Or when I go out and watch like yesterday I got to watch it was like a live jazz show in Prospect Park. There were parts of that got me thinking about obviously because it's music, but stuff I'm trying to do at Spotify and like I'm looking around like I will read a book on paper or I will read a piece of fiction about a couple in a small town in Texas. If we go back to the memory palace of chaos, of things floating around in that space, if we were to, and I've never really thought about it this way, but as you said it, it makes a lot of sense to me. If we were to imagine all of those things that you could introduce into that space, if just design ideas, just design frameworks and tech stuff that we think about are like one type of particle moving in a certain way, like there's actually no chaos. It's just very predictable. But if we can introduce all sorts of different types of things that collide with each other in weird ways, I love that idea that like one bit of information can change how you think about a different idea that you heard. And that translation maybe reframes a whole other thing that like you've known for your whole life. I have a running list, or I guess a aggregation of lists of different ideas. Like one of them, maybe we started talking about this last time, but like I was reading something about time loops and about dreams and just the idea that we communicate with our past selves via memories, but we could also communicate with our future selves via dreams, or our future selves might be able to communicate with our current selves via dreams. And while it sounds like a wacky idea, I think that could be an interesting framing for us in technology as we're trying to look beyond the present. Like if I can help any technologist, any tech worker, any designer, any developer, any PM be less focused in the present, if I can create like a mental model for them to be like, yeah, actually, we are living in four dimension, time being the fourth dimension, without that feeling like a kooky sci-fi, like, okay, Vicky, like we're at work now, right? Like if I can make that concept feel tangible, then second or third order effects of that on the products we build and then on people living in the world using these products feels like massive. And no one at work is talking about time loops or four-dimensional creatures. Conversely, like the opposite end of that, like a very low tech is paper. And I've been, at least last year, experimenting with paper engineering and reading books about just like the subtleness of paper and how it's changed our ability to, like, the fact that we can write things down unlocked so much stuff for us as like humans who think about stuff, human cognition. The fact that you don't have to hold everything in your memory, I think it feels like an understated technology, paper or writing. But beyond it being a place to write down on, paper also has a lot of like the blankness of a white piece of paper has a lot of potential. The idea that paper is like contains memory. If you fold it, it will never be flat again. All those things were consumed over days and weeks and months and seemingly have nothing to do with each other. But I'm interested in like bringing some of these, like, they're not necessarily even novel ideas, but they're maybe new combinations of ideas and just how that can help us loosen our playbooks in tech for better, for better, not worse.
Yeah, one of my favorite TED Talks is titled "When Ideas Have Sex."
Yes, I love that.
And it's all about the creation of new ideas from the combination of ideas and and it speeds up over history. And really, the more it happens, the faster things change. I think it's really beautiful. And so, yeah, I don't quite know where to go from here, but I have
There's no good segue from ideas have sex.
yeah, but I have a question about the book that you are working on, and it's a book about cognitive bias, and you're trying to make it more accessible. So, what are you trying to say with this book, and what change would you like to enact with this book?
Yeah, I love that. This is a good transition because we have been talking about like tech or products that try to do good or try to impact the world, or my frustrations with how some of them have maybe under the guise of doing good haven't actually or have had other ulterior motives. Is fine. We're trying to make money. Everyone's trying to live. The book is actually just a result of those feelings or those frustrations, and not in like a purely creative project, but in a tangible, impactful way. So I have, a long time ago, like we've been talking about, I studied behavioral science. I'm not a like a researcher in it. I don't have any new ideas about cognitive bias, how it shows up in the world. I've probably read less text about it than some people who are big fans of it. But what I do all day at work is make things digestible, easy to use, make good experiences for people. And so I think it occurred to me that there's like a portion of the population that loves thinking about thinking. Like they like the idea of cognition or like hacking it or productivity, or I don't know what to categorize this group of people as, but they read those books. And then there's like everyone else in the world who doesn't really care about thinking and they just go about their day. Maybe they think about other things, but there's not that metacognition happening. Yet they have to make decisions every day about financial stuff, about speaking of dating, who to live with, who to be with, about job stuff, just like consequential life decisions. And I found that either people have a lot of rigor to that or none at all. Or like they consult friends, they consult advice columns, they consult their gut, they consult astrology or tarot, or there's just like such a range of ways to make a decision. And I wanted to make this type of framework available for them as well. These like unconscious ways in which we might make decisions that are not in our own best self-interest. And so the original idea for the book is that it was a visual, like an illustrated book For all intents, it looks like a children's book, though there's more illustrated adult books now. And you could interact with it. You could rotate it. You could maybe a different spread, you would expand it. Maybe you would reveal something, and that interaction would reveal the bias. So it would show versus tell how the bias is affecting an everyday scenario in your life. And I just thought, like, you know what? Like, make it easy. Like, make it easy for people to understand. Make it poignant. This is, and I'm sure, a type of marketing or some sort of advertising. Like, make it impactful and memorable, but in a useful way. Like, I'm not trying to sell you anything except for self coherence. I want you to do what's best for yourself. And as I spoke more with the agent, it's transformed more into a written book that might have illustrations. And I'm okay with that. I think there's a useful guide in an agent because they know what's going to appeal or sell to the mass market. And more than making money in that way, I think if I want to help more people, it needs to be available, like, to more people, available in that they would grab it off of a shelf and use it. Does that answer your question of, like, why the book? Like, why is a designer trying to write a book? I can't even write.
I love this so much. And fair disclosure, self-published a book a few years ago that's an illustrated book for adults called The Book of Hard Truths.
I love that.
And it was 16 hard truths about life that we should learn to accept because we can reach peace if we stop fighting them.
Wow.
And it was a very much, I think, the same thing of a product designer thinking of a book as a product that is going to generate something, some transformation in the reader.
Yeah.
But unlike you, I didn't have, I think, the patience of finding an agent and doing it like the traditional route, which I would now do.
Yeah.
After having self-published a book without any support.
But then you had complete freedom.
I had complete freedom to mess it up and create a very expensive book because the illustrations are like full color, full page. For me, I actually at that moment didn't care. It was a creative outlet. But looking back, I think I probably would have been wise to do what you do, which is work with a professional, figure out what's the right thing to make for the market so that it actually affects more people. Because I think probably under 1,000 people ever read this book.
Oh, and it's not too late, right? To then bring that.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm working on something more ambitious now, but but I think there's something about a product designer writing a book. And the same is true with Jake Knapp and the Sprint book, I think. And they approached it as a design project. And I approached this design project, which means that we expect results. It's not just a book. You read it, right? We expect like, oh, this is going to do this to the user.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because the people who write the books, especially if we're talking about a nonfiction like research approach or something, the people who do the research aren't always the best people to share about it because they're researchers, right? They didn't spend their time becoming experts in communicators or teachers or whatever. Maybe teachers, I don't know. But so I think there is this beautiful, like, it's a great fit for certain things for designers to take what exists and then make it accessible for other populations. And you see this in the worst way with TikTok and Instagram influencers, where they are highly attuned to the messages that are going to hit with people, or even the messaging, the format, the delivery or whatever, like the virality, but they have no expertise. And so that's on the other end of the spectrum, right? You had, let's say, a pure researcher writing a book, and then you've got like a pure influencer who maybe they're not an expert in whatever they're influencing on. Say it's a health influencer. They're just healthy. And then they're doing the communication, like somewhere in between.
I'm going to defend TikTok here because I've been following some physicists on TikTok and some professors, and there's some people who are doing both, right? Like actually making things accessible that they know about.
Yes. And if they're experts Amazing. And I love that the medium can nudge them and teach them how to share. Yeah, I guess the TikTok example was for just when you're a random person
Yeah.
making claims.
So I have a closing question. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A
Mm.
lecture being a boring, modern way of delivering information, and you make up your own mind. And the sermon being an urgent plea to change someone's life, really taking them seriously and trying to really help them. And he longs for the days of sermons, and he thinks we let them go too easily in the modern
Mm.
age. And so if you had a chance to give a short sermon, what would it be about?
I think it would be about these ideas, these themes that we've been revisiting throughout this talk, which would also be the evolution of the ideas or I think we could call them sermons. The sermons I've given so far, the talks I've given so far, have been trying to give credence or give form or give validity to a softer, like less tangible way of designing it, at least. And I've been thinking of a talk, and we can call it a sermon, which makes me uncomfortable. But I've been thinking of this idea of like going dreamy. We've talked about dreams a couple of times, but it feels like we've lost our ability to think about dreams as useful things. Dreamers are described as untethered or like distracted or like, they're not working, they're not productive, or the idea that they're opposite from like a thinker who is aware. But I'm really interested in trying to get designers, but also just people to think about dreams being blueprints for reality and the idea that reality can be found in dreams and they're not just disparate, separate things. We don't think twice about memories. We remember something. It's in some ways, it's a figment of our imagination when we remember something. It exists only in our mind. And we take that to be every day, like, oh, yeah, I remember that. Even though it actually have sense. A lot of times they're wrong. They're fallible, right? They're imperfect communication tools with our past selves. Yet when we dream, experiencing a dream while sleeping, we throw those away completely. Like we don't throw them away, but we don't think of them as we do of memories. And so I really want to have a sermon about like helping people, giving validity to all these things that we've been talking about that do feel dreamy, that do feel untethered, that do feel like there's no place for those in work or design or like serious things. We don't need to be that serious about the approach. We can have feelings about our designs at work. And it's going to take time, I think, to make people comfortable with the idea before they can start using the ideas.
All right. Thank you, Vicki. I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. Like just going on random tangents is like my ideal way of having conversations. So thank you for listening.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well everyone, and see you next week on Remake.